Everything is great. It's so good to
Okay.
see you, my old friend.
It's
It's been a long time.
long time no see. How's everything?
Long time no see. That's right. It's been what? How many years? 8 years? 9 years since you
Nine
graduated?
years. 9 years.
9 years.
Oh my
Wow.
God.
Unbelievable.
Time flies.
Yes, it does. We're both married with kids now. Can you believe
Yep.
it? Wow.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Brandy, for this lovely meeting, and thank you for accepting the invitation for another round of discussion that has to do with language learning, and language acquisition and language teaching.
Thank you so much for having me on here. You've had some big names lately. Wow, so
Well,
impressive, Wally. So
thank you
impressive.
so much. Very lucky to get their acceptance of the invitations. I insisted vehemently on them to have short interview. I just wanted to make something different when it comes to motivating people to learn English, not particularly English, but other languages. So not to be biased to English, just because we are English teachers does not mean that we marginalize other
Right.
languages.
Right.
Just for curiosity, have you been learning any other languages, or are you stuck with English?
You know, unfortunately, the joke about, Americans, right? So
Yep.
person who speaks 3 languages is trilingual, someone who speaks 2 is bilingual, and someone who speaks 1 is American.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's me. I still really only speak 1 language, which is English. I've learned little bits of, Spanish and some Mandarin Chinese in my travels to China, a little bit of Hindi. But
well, one of your merits
mostly
is
just English.
one of the merits of speaking English is that you have the apparatus as an English teacher. You have the equipment that can speed up, expedite your learning of other languages, just because we've come from a lot of theory in this field. So we think that we do, to some extent, have the shortcuts to other languages learning, especially the languages that share some commonality with English, such as Spanish, because there's big population of Mexican and Spanish people in the United States. So probably that's one of the privilege. I think you have a deck of cards for some basic Spanish words
Absolutely.
from back
Absolutely.
in California and moving around the United States. This podcast is extremely casual. We are not restricted to any topic. We can digress as much as possible. And there is no strings attached to any particular topic in language. And I think that gives us more flexibility to tap on our experience and enlighten people about some shortcuts, especially in the EFL context. And today, we're planning to discuss your experience in language. By the way, is my voice clear or not?
Perfect. You sound great.
Okay, perfect. So, first of all, I know you for sure, but I want you to introduce yourself, where you're coming from, and why you started your career as an English teacher.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I love this. Okay, so my name's Brandy, of course, and I've been teaching English for about 8 years now. When I was in my undergrad, going through my undergrad, I was majoring in English and philosophy and pre-law. I thought I wanted to go to law school. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And then I did a trip to India for a short time this summer. I was volunteering, doing some volunteer work there, and I was teaching 4th and 5th grade English to Indian students, and I just absolutely loved it. I fell in love with it. I always thought, I don't want to teach. I don't want to be a teacher. I like English. I like reading and writing in English. I'm a pretty good writer, love reading books, but I don't want to teach. Oh, I don't want to be a teacher. That sounds terrible. That was always my attitude. And then I went there and did some volunteer teaching, and it really changed my life. It changed my whole life. I came back to the US, completely decided I was not going to go to law school anymore. I was going to go get a master's in teaching English to speakers of other languages. And that's what I did. I loved my experience. I met you and many other great colleagues and friends, and came back to my home state of Illinois. I'm from Illinois, which is where Chicago is at for your viewers out there. You may not know where Illinois is, but that's where Chicago's at. And I teach at a small school about 3.5 hours south of Chicago. So I've taught at both the college level and also at the high school level. I'm at a high school right now.
That's going to be an asset for our upcoming question, to draw some comparison between the high school kind of experience that you have and teaching at community and college level. But first of all, what was the detour that this kind of wrong road sometimes where we face and determine to be either a teacher or find another career? And I know that the trip that you made to India was just one of the key milestones of your experience in language, but why did you decide to become a teacher? First of all, if you could just tell us a little bit about that part.
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I grew up in a very small town, and my entire town was white, middle class, Christian. There was no diversity. And so my impression, my understanding of teaching was in that context, working with other Americans and teaching English to other Americans, right? So I always felt like that's just not a good fit for me. But then taking that trip to India and experiencing another culture, especially a culture that's so different from my own for the first time, and having such wonderful cultural exchange with those students, being able to see them learning in real time, practicing words that they didn't know yesterday. Now here they are using them. It was amazing. It was so rewarding. I mean, I think all the cliche things that you say about teaching, about how rewarding it is and what a satisfying career it is and how meaningful it is to connect with students on that level, all of that's true. All of that's true. I've always found that to be true in my own teaching experience. I have so many wonderful connections with college students, with high school students, even with those young learners back in India. I mean, it's just, they are things that just fill my heart, right? They just really bring me so much meaning and joy in my life to have those connections with students.
Can we say that was intrinsic motivation to?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
That's a favorite word by John Hedgecock.
I love him. Shout out to John.
He was very sensitive to this kind of topic because he doesn't like the word motivation, and he always tried to replace it with alternatives like willingness to communicate. I still remember that. It echoes in my mind.
That's good. I don't remember that from grad school.
It's quite interesting that you have this spectrum of experience when it comes to teaching multiple ethnicities and multiple nationalities. Since India is it considered an Asian country? I'm not.
Yeah.
Okay,
at least in the American perspective.
There is some sort of analogy that we just need to draw here, because I want you to tell me a little bit about the difference, the cons and pros of teaching English in India and teaching English in the United States. Which one outweighs the other in terms of the merits and the quality of education and the learnability of language, based on your experience, of course?
Yeah. I'll also draw in a little bit from my experience teaching in China too, because I've done
the floor is yours.
Say it again.
The floor is yours.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've also done some short-term teaching experiences in China too, and that was really more teacher training. So working with ESL teachers in China on how, what are best practices for teaching and how to motivate students and things like that. So all of my international experiences have been incredibly rewarding in terms of being able to travel and learn about other cultures, learn a little bit of language while I'm working. But I would say the advantage for students coming to the United States or coming to any, English-speaking country who are wanting to learn English, there's a huge advantage to doing that. Of course, you're immersed in the culture. I talk about that. Immersion is a big thing in our field. And you have the opportunity to speak and listen and practice those skills constantly, day after day after day, even in your daily life, going to the bank, going to the grocery store. You're not just in class practicing your English, you're out in the world. And so for my college students, that was a huge advantage for them. They often had American roommates. They had American friends that they were making and going to parties, American parties and things. So that was a huge advantage for them to have those kinds of opportunities. For those who are studying abroad or who are in an EFL context like yours, I can't imagine how difficult it is to have those opportunities for practicing. But you just have to be, in my opinion, you just have to be highly motivated. You have to have that intrinsic motivation, as you said, and seek out those opportunities, right? Find them wherever you can find them and become dedicated to really practicing the craft of speaking and listening in another language. And it's tough. It's tough. It's not kind of built in if you're not in an immersion type of environment, but it's still possible. I don't know if I answered your question.
That segues to, yeah, of course. Okay. That segues to my next question. Well, it's actually digressing on the same topic that we're talking about. When it comes to teaching English in the United States, especially in high school, we have an old system here in this country, and probably the whole idea of actually talking to you right now came from the thought of enlightening people about modern approaches and methods and techniques that is sort of relevant socially to the social need of language and why English learning necessitates the fact of trying different approaches and trying different methods to learn. In Iraq particularly, we have this lecturing style that is based on the old grammar translation method and some archaic methods, just because the whole infrastructure of education is just corroded from inside and lacks the basic elements of or the foundational elements of why we should learn English. Was watching a video yesterday where that scientist from Massachusetts Institute of Technology was referring to two elements that can be considered once students graduate from university, that they need to be able to communicate well, and they need to speak well, they need to write well. So if the university does not graduate students having this mindset and this kind of skills, they would have failed their job, because what's the benefit of teaching students and then graduating them, ultimately not being able to communicate or write well?
Yeah,
so
they might have the content up here, but they can't communicate it well.
Definitely. So based on experience, we're not saying that, well, we have some weaknesses sometimes when we talk about the education system in the United States. It's a huge country, so there are so many challenges, but eventually speaking, the kind of opportunity that an English teacher gets in the United States probably makes him privileged compared to people teaching English in Middle East or in MENA, Middle East and North Africa, or in India or in China.
Absolutely.
So this probably takes a little bit of time to talk about, but I would love actually to ask you to tap on your experience to talk about that part of education in the United States. How is
so
it
you're
different?
wanting me to kind of compare it to what I'm seeing elsewhere. Got it.
Yeah,
okay.
Based on your observation, of course.
Yeah. I think that you're hitting on a lot of the same things I would say as well. That, for example, with my college students, many of them, let's say Asian students, for example, I'll take them as an example here. Many of them come to the US and they're in a university in the US, and they expect college to be the same. They expect university to be the same in the US as it is back home in Korea, China, Japan. And they are expecting lecture style, right? They're expecting to just take notes the entire time.
Of course.
The teacher is going to be talking. The teacher's just going to pour knowledge into their brain. They're going to take notes and they're going to learn, right? They're going to take tests and they're going to learn. And they come here and they realize that education is quite different. The expectations that professors have are quite different. And so, you know, we talk about that a lot during their orientation when they first come. And then as they're taking their ESL classes, we're discussing that constantly, that, you know, while you're here in the US, you have to become like an American learner. You have to participate in class. You have to share your opinion. The professor's constantly going to be asking you, what do you think about this, right? Here's a video. Now let's talk about it. What do you think? Share your opinion. Why do you think that? And they're going to be pushing you to kind of think critically, think deeply about these topics and write about them, right? Read about them, write about them. And it can be uncomfortable for students at first because they think like, well, I'm just the student. I don't have anything to say. Or what I have to say is not important, right? You're the professor. You tell me what's important, right? And it's not like that in the US. The teacher is very much valuing that kind of discussion, that kind of conversation in the classroom. And so that's an adjustment that they have to make.
So do you think
it takes a while, but they get there?
Do you think that the English topic teacher in the United States is a source of knowledge or a facilitator of transferring knowledge into students' minds and helping them think of it differently?
Absolutely. I would say they are a facilitator, because for me, at least, I like to think of my classroom as a community of learners in which I am also one of those learners. And we all come to the classroom with valuable experiences, right? From our own culture, from our own background, from our own language, and we're learning together, we're sharing together. So typically my classroom, my ESL classroom, is very diverse. I have a lot of African students, I have a lot of Asian students, I have a lot of Spanish-speaking students from Central and South America. And so we all have things that we can share and learn and teach each other, right? So absolutely, I would say that the teacher or the professor is just a facilitator. They bring the conversation to the table, they present the idea, and then the community, the classroom community, really shares and learns together.
Now, that's quite interesting that you mentioned that the teacher is not a source of knowledge, but a facilitator, because that is going to make a huge difference when it comes to students' realization and conceptualization of the topic that they're studying, they're analyzing. So I want you to do some sort of reverse engineering of the major elements that set the English teacher apart in the United States from the English teacher in China or India, because that is where you travel to.
Yeah, I would say that in other countries where you have an ESL teacher who is teaching their students English, right? They are the only source of English knowledge, perhaps, in that community or in that school. And so they're kind of considered the expert on English for that community. And so they would be the person who is pouring all of this knowledge into the students' heads, right? So they're the ones that are the teacher. They're the ones creating those lectures and those lesson plans and asking the students to participate, right? But I think in an American context, it's quite different, where we are working together to learn these concepts.
Collaboratively.
Right? Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, now that's quite interesting, and it's actually quite insightful to hear this lovely comment about that part from you. Let's go a little bit deeper to talk about the content of the lessons that you do in the classroom, and specifically reading. How do you foster love of reading in the classroom? What kind of social context? Let me rephrase. How do you contextualize reading in the classroom to an extent that students come to love it and synthesize it and make it a regular daily routine habit of their daily life?
Yeah. I love reading. I'm a big fan of literature myself. So I always want my students to be readers. But this is something that's been quite different from moving from the kind of college context to the high school context. My college students are familiar with a lot of academic reading. They're comfortable doing academic reading. But my high schoolers, many of them will say, oh, I don't like to read. I hate reading, right? Or they'll tell me, I've never read a book in English before. Maybe I've never read a book in my first language before. Now you want me to read a book in English? Come on, no way. No. Right. And so they can feel overwhelmed very much. What'd you say?
I wanted to say that it's quite interesting that the majority of my memories of reading comes from high school reading, not from college reading. And I think that's just because my memory at that time was fresher than when I shifted to university, where I was more engaged with reading old texts of poems and during William Shakespeare time, and reading about the Renaissance and that kind of historical data that can just be flushed out of my memory once the course is over. Unlike the kind of interesting novels and short stories and graded readers that I did in high school, because they just fascinated me, like Around the World in 80 Days, or Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, and Between Two Cities, or Hard Times, or Pride and Prejudice, or Crime and Punishment. That kind of Russian and English literature just made me more fascinated with reading, because it was not controlled and dictated on me. I was just doing it naturally and automatically. But when I shifted to and transitioned to university, it was dictated on me to read this and that. I'm not the kind of person who does well with people instructing me on what to read.
Being forced to read. Yeah.
So well, that's interesting, because I want to ask you this question. How do you deal with stubborn students in the classroom?
I have a lot of, I would say I have a lot of reluctant readers. They don't like to read, or they tell me they don't like to read. And I don't think that's true. I don't think there are people who don't like to read. I think there are only people who haven't figured out what they like to read yet. And so one of the things I do with my students is I like to show them a lot of different styles of writing, so that they get this kind of exposure to a lot of different things. So for example, I will always, in an academic year, I will always choose one verse novel, or sometimes called novel in verse, which, if you're not familiar, is, a poem for each chapter. So it's not separate poems, right? It's telling a full, rich, interesting story. But there's a lot less text on the page. So it's a lot less overwhelming to the students. So that's one thing. We do that kind of early on to kind of get their feet wet and get them warmed up for reading. Another thing I love to do is bring in graphic novels. And graphic novels are so much fun. I'm a big fan of reading graphic novels, and I love to use them in my classroom teaching as well. Graphic novels, you can think of like a comic book.
Do you do pre-teaching for
telling a full story?
For graphic novels, do you do pre-teaching of vocabulary? Like, you dedicated some time during the procedure of the lesson to pre-teach the vocabulary, or you just directly tsunami students with graphic novel and they have to face the music?
It's a great question. So I would say at the beginning of the story, we're talking a lot about the context, right? When is the author writing? Who is the author? What are some important vocabulary words that we need to know? So we're kind of setting ourselves up for success. And then as we continue reading through the novel, I would say I remove more and more of that scaffolding. So I kind of take away pieces so they become more independent. They have to do more independent work related to the novel. So then they're having to find words that they don't recognize and go look it up, right? So then the work is on them to find some vocabulary words.
I'm quite impressed, actually, because your teaching is multidimensional, because you're raising, as far as I hear from you, you're raising people's awareness and background. You kind of activate the schemata regarding this topic so they can become more conducive to learning and understanding of the topic. Unlike somebody who just throws the graphic novel on the table and just expects them to assumingly read it and digest it and understand it and respond back. So this multidimensional pattern of teaching is really interesting. And I think that we, to some extent here in this country, lack this kind of approach, especially talking and selecting topics, because the kind of topics that are taught in the school are dictated by the Ministry of Education, which is really a bummer, because the teacher does not have any role. They're just a conduit or a channel of transferring the data from one textbook to their mind and expecting them to just ricochet the same kind of data back in the quizzes, the monthly quizzes. I know, because you told me that you're very interested in social justice and social topics and the minority rights. So how do you incorporate that in your curriculum? Especially you're dealing with multinational group of students in the classroom.
So that's interesting to hear you comment about the Ministry of Justice and them requiring, certain curriculum taught in Iraqi schools. So I would say that for most situations, there are certain standards in the US of what students have to meet. They have to be able to do these things, but American teachers have a lot of freedom over how
Can you give me a perspective on one or two of these standards, if you're familiar?
Sure. So one standard might be, in an English class, for example, a student has to be able to read something and critically respond to it, react to it in writing, or they need to watch something and present on it, right? They need to be able to have those skills. So it's very skill-based. But one thing that's wonderful, that's very nice, is that American teachers often have more flexibility in the content. So as long as I'm teaching those skills, the students, I can choose what the students are reading and writing about and watching. So I choose things that are interesting for me. So my entire yearly academic curriculum is focused on social justice. And that really means looking at issues of racism and oppression and marginalization for minority groups living in the US. So we're talking about, anyone who's not white. What is their experience like living in the US? So for example, how I organize a year, I will have maybe a unit on, let's say, Native Americans. So the first people that lived in the US, right, before the United States was a country. So we talk about the colonization of the United States with Europeans coming over. So there's a lot of history that comes into the class as well. And then we compare that to what is the situation like now for Native Americans. And so we'll read a novel that tells the story of a young Native American teenager growing up, living in a white community, going to an all-white school. What is life like for him, right? And then the next unit might be on Asian Americans. And once again, we'll talk about the historical context, right? The very first Chinese immigrants that came over to the US and what was their experience like? How were they treated? Then we cover, all the way up through World War II and the Japanese internment camps. And what was that experience like? You read a graphic novel about the Japanese
for high school.
Camps.
For high school particularly, do you have a final test, or how do you segue these kind of topics to a final year graduation in terms of like the weight of the test, if that is available, because you mentioned that you selectively choose the topics based on your own discretion and familiarity with the kind of nationalities and the kind of approach that you have based on your philosophy of language teaching and your experience coming from different countries, teaching in different countries, and having huge wide spectrum of samples of lessons and plans that you've administered before. So how do you ensure that the students graduate to passing the final exam, if there is final exam for high school?
Right. Yeah. So for my class, I get to decide what a final exam looks like. And so typically I will do some vocab or some grammar on a short exam. And then typically it's a final project. So they can like write a portfolio. Paper. Exactly. They can write a paper for their final project. They can give a presentation for their final project. So they have some flexibility in terms of how they show their learning, how they showed me that they learned these concepts and that they can perform these skills of either presenting or writing or whatever it is. Yeah. Yeah. So all of my year is really focused around different groups, minority groups. So, you know, especially with the Asian American unit, it's become quite interesting in the last year to really look at the history of Asian Americans in the US and compare that to, because of COVID, how are Asian Americans being treated in the US today, right? We also will do a unit on typically 9/11 and how has 9/11 impacted the experience of Muslim Americans or Arab Americans living in the US. Of course, we talk about Black Americans. We go all the way back to slavery. So they're reading slave narratives of people who became free, who escaped slavery. They're writing about it, they're reading about it, they're watching things about it. Then we go all the way up to what's the experience for Black Americans today. We talk about Black Lives Matter. We talk about George Floyd, right? So these are kind of heavy topics, very serious topics, but
relevant.
What's incredible, but relevant.
They're relevant.
Very relevant. I love that you said that because they are so relevant. My students are all Black, Asian, Hispanic, right? These are things that relate to them. So that's one way that I pull them in and help them get engaged with content.
It's actually quite interesting that we raised both this particular aspect, because based on my modest experience of teaching English, I really noticed that the students respond quite dramatically better if the topic that we are talking about has to do with their background information and is socially relevant to them. So, or has one of these criteria or standards that it's either relevant to them, has to do with their background information. If they do not know about that topic, they wouldn't respond the same with the same efficiency, with the same effectiveness and engagement.
That's exactly what I see in class, Walid, is that students will say to me, wow, we talk about everything in this class, don't we? Wow, there's no topics that are off limits. We're getting serious in this class, aren't we, Miss B? And I say, yes, we are, because this is relevant to us. This is happening right now in the US. You guys might be experiencing this when you're outside of the school, right? Or even in the school, you might be experiencing things. And so, yeah, absolutely, it's relevant.
One last thing.
Yeah.
Since you're fascinated with graphic novels, do we expect to see a graphic novel written by Brandy?
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
I will just take it for granted and take it and start teaching it to my students.
Oh my gosh, that is so funny that you brought this up. This, for your audience who's listening, this
people
was not
say that everybody has a book on his chest, but everybody's waiting the right time, you know, to do that.
Yeah, well, this was not a question I was expecting from you, but you know what's so funny, Walid, is that about, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago, I said to my husband, I'm going to write a graphic novel. And he said, what? What do you have to say? What are you going to write a graphic novel about? And I said, well, I'm going to write about my experience being very, very tall. It's going to be called Tales of a Tall Girl.
Listen,
it's going to be about my experience growing up being very different, very tall. For those of you who can't tell,
I really think
I'm very, very tall.
I still have a photo. I still have a photo back from our graduation where where we stood together and we took a photo in the meeting classroom where we used to meet for Dr. Peter. And you where I was like,
you're up to my shoulder, right?
I was like a midget compared to you at that time. I'm really excited actually to read it once it gets fully cooked.
We'll see. We'll see if it ever comes. It's kind of it's a dream, but I don't know if it'll happen.
Since I'm very engaged nowadays and busy with my PhD,
I have a question for you.
Since I met Steven Pinker and Noam Chomsky, I started to think of writing down a transcription of what we talked about. So transcribing the speech of the videos that they did and just compiling list of the videos that I did as interviews, and probably just call it memoir of a linguist or memoir of an English teacher. I still haven't decided the final title of it, but it's just my memories as an EFL learner and teacher at the same time. You had a question? I think you
Love
wanted.
it. Yeah. So I have a question for you because you are obviously working a lot and you're also studying in your PhD. So I'm wondering, how are you balancing that? Because I'm about a few weeks away from starting a PhD program and I'll be teaching and I have 2 little kids. So how do you balance all of these things and how do you carve out time for all of the things you have to do?
Well, I cannot generalize because the kind of context where I studied PhD in Iraq is a little bit different from where I studied MA in the United States. But generally speaking, you get attacked the first semester with a fire hydrant manuals and reading sources, and you got to drink from that fire hydrant. That's probably the closest analogy that I have in mind.
That's a beautiful analogy. Okay, I'm visualizing that, and I can see it.
So once you get closer to it, you just get that kind of water on your face. So we have so many things to do the first semester, especially they have this kind of highly demanding class where you just need to prep the title of your dissertation and think about where you're taking your PhD to. The first semester, they keep reminding you because they will say, well, they already told us once we started this semester that time will fly quickly and you just need to determine the kind of trajectory that you have with your PhDs, because that is going to give you a better idea and vision for where you want to be. And it was really hard for me.
Have you found that to be true, that time has flown and you've had to
really like I've been doing my PhD for 3 years. This is my 3rd year, and it just flew like flashing light, to be honest. It just I can't believe that I'm on my 3rd year, and it just really flies quickly. So you just need to wrap things up just from the beginning, thinking about the direction that you have, meeting your supervisor quite on regular basis, just because if you go low-key the first time, the first few months, it's going to be really hard to get back to shape and continue reading. PhD is kind of not as challenging as MA when it comes to the intensity of the courses, because they do not deal with you as a kind of like in between graduate student. They deal with you as an English professor. So they talk to you as an English professor. So going back to your question of how I manage my time, I just have a checklist of things that I decide to do for one day ahead. I do not decide on what to do on the 3 or 4 days because I'm really bad at multitasking, and I do not want to think that my full week is fully packed, because that is going to frustrate me, and
overwhelm
I'm
me.
kind of lazy person that thinks that I have the whole day work. So I just need to focus on what's ahead, what's the 24 hours ahead of me, and think of what I will do in them. Like so early in the morning, I wake up around 6 or 7. I prep my cup of coffee, and then I start doing the checklist of things that I will do. Today, for example, since I talked back with Steven Pinker, he recommended me to read English, and politics. There's an essay on English language and politics. I read it before, so I just started reading it today again, just to review, because he emphasized on that one. And I wrote part of the dissertation. I wrote a couple of pages. I did some reading, and then I watched videos, and I started design. I'm very fascinated with designing English lessons. And I started working on a podcast series. So this is my 8th series. The podcast talks about, I incorporate the most common verbs and nouns and adjectives in this podcast, but I do it as a conversational style. So I just talk, and while I'm talking, there's a pop-up of a word, whether it's an adjective or a noun or an adverb. That takes some of my time. Then I played around with kids. I took them do some shopping, and then I came back. So it's interesting, especially on your third year. The first year, like you wouldn't. We have a saying in Iraq, you wouldn't be able to scratch your head because of the amount of work that you do. So the first year is kind of challenging, but then the second and third year, once you graduate to second and third year, it's going to be really easier than the first year.
We'll feel like you're in a rhythm now.
Of course, we'll stay together. We'll always talk about it. Once you have any kind of concerns about PhD, I don't know if I can help, but I will definitely try my best.
Well, you're an inspiration at the least. So it's wonderful to see you doing so well. And I'm really inspired by you. You're doing great work.
Brandy, thank you so much for your lovely acceptance of this interview. You're such a great mother, a great teacher, and hopefully, fingers crossed, a great graphic novels writer.
We'll see. Thank you so much, Walid. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I really loved it.
Thank you so much. We'll stay in touch, and I'll send you the link once things are done with the editing, maybe tomorrow.
Sounds great.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye. Say hi to your kids.
Yes, I will. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.